Hello and welcome back once again. I'm Elizabeth and this is Time Scholar and I'm very happy to have you here today. I also got a new microphone, so I hope there is less sort of white noise issues in the background and things as well, and I hope that you can all hear me a bit better as well. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for over 300 subscribers. I was just thanking you for over 200 in my last video. This is absolutely insane. I'm so happy that other people are enjoying what I'm doing and enjoying the history that I'm sort of talking about and the content I'm creating. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for that, firstly. So today's video, I do just want to say, is going to be a bit of a heavier topic. It is something that still affects people to this day, especially the Indigenous Australian community and the Torres Strait Islander community. As you saw in the title, I am going to be talking about the colonisation of Australia. And this is a subject that is quite close to me and one that I'm quite interested in as an Australian person as well. So I just want to add a disclaimer here as well that this is by no means a complete history of the colonisation of Australia. The topic itself is incredibly vast, and I don't want to delve into aspects of the history that I have not done enough research in either. So I don't want to do that with the amount sort of that the history still holds so much weight today as well. So I want to make sure that I'm respecting the history and its impact by only discussing things that I've actually done my research in. And as always, I will include a bibliography in the biography below, so if you want to see where I got any of my research from, you are more than free to look down there and, yeah, see where I did my research as well. So sit back, grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever beverage you prefer, because I can say for free that this video is going to be a long one. So strap in and let's go. So firstly, I did want to talk to why this subject is one that I am quite interested in and one that I really did want to talk about and speak more to on this channel as well, and that is actually due to my own heritage. So my mother's side of the family is actually of Aboriginal and free white settler descent. So this woman here, right here, photo of her and her two children, is Annie Butler, and she is my great-great-great-grandmother, and she was an Aboriginal woman. And she was married to William McClymont, who I'll put here as well, and his family had emigrated to Nabiac in New South Wales from Ayr in Scotland, and they were free settlers. They weren't convicts or anything either. And between them, they actually had 9 children, and yeah, so that is my mother's, that's my maternal line there. So members of my family as well are very much involved with Aboriginal culture. So my aunt and my cousins is really part of their everyday life. They still live there. You know, I haven't had that connection to it anyway because firstly, I moved to the United Kingdom when I was a child. I grew up in the southeast of England, and secondly, my dad's parents both emigrated over to Tasmania, so he hasn't got any sort of Aboriginal heritage himself, so there's also that part of it. But yeah, so for my aunt and cousins, this is very much a part of their everyday lives, and they're very involved in their Aboriginal culture. So yeah, this is why I do have a bit of a vested interest in the colonialization of Australia, as it is a history that my ancestors were directly affected by and directly affected as well in their actions. So it was actually about 50,000 to 65,000 years ago that the ancestors of Australian Aboriginals actually moved into the land that we now know as modern-day Australia. So it's believed that the Majabebe rock shelter in the north of Australia is perhaps the oldest site of human occupation there as well, which really just goes to show how long the Indigenous population of Australia has been there as well. So over the years, these people started to move about Australia, and this is due to mostly climate change with falling and rising sea levels, with, you know, like a lot of, due to rising sea levels, the actual land of Australia, I'll put a photo here, it's really interesting, a lot of the land of Australia is actually now underwater. So what we know as modern day Australia was not sort of prehistory Australia by any means. So, and this sort of this climate change really changed the landscape of Australia as well, as I mentioned, with the rising sea levels, but also with things like about 14,000 years ago, Tasmania actually broke off of mainland Australia, and then about 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Torres Strait Islands were formed. And then 4,000 years ago, people started to sort of inhabit the Torres Strait Islands as well. So there was a lot of different things happening in Australia at this point in time. And due to the separation, Torres Strait Islanders, Tasmanian Aboriginals, and mainland Australian Aboriginals all started to create their own distinctive cultures as well, because they were separated from each other. Australia is such a vast country as well, that these different cultures and sort of, you know, languages as well really were very different, even across mainland Australia, because it is a massive, massive country. So, and this can actually also be seen through language, with there being over 250 Aboriginal languages, with over 800 dialects that were in use at the time of British colonisation, which is just an absolutely insane amount of languages in my eyes they were used every day. They were used by various different people every day within Australia. And Aboriginal society itself consisted of family groups that would then also be within bands or clans, and then these clans would then attach to tribes or nations, and then all of these would be associated with their own particular language and land. Land was incredibly important to Aboriginal people. It still is today as well. You know, it's a spiritual connection, it's a kinship connection. Land is so important. The land on which you were upon was part of, it still is part of Aboriginal identity. So Aboriginal society works without chiefs or government. Instead, authority rests in the hands of elders who had come to a consensus regarding any decisions as well. And the economy was cooperative, with food being shared within and exchanged across groups as well. And this is all on the research that I've done as well, so I apologise if I am incorrect. And Aboriginal Australians also had their own unique and spiritual and artistic culture as well. I feel like a lot of people are very familiar with Aboriginal sort of paintings and art. I'll put some photos here as well. But they also had their own sort of spiritual connections as well. And so overall, Aboriginal Australians had inhabited Australia and the outlying islands for thousands upon thousands of years before European exploration or intervention either. You know, they were just living absolutely happily within Australia and its surrounding islands at this time, and that did all change upon European exploration and mainly British colonisation. So although we know that Australia was ultimately colonised by Britain, there was earlier European interest in the continent, the country as well. So in 1606, the Dutch East India Company, which was captained by Willem Janszoon, landed in Australia. And then in 1616, another Dutchman, Dirk Hartog, landed on an island off of Western Australia as well. And then in 1627, the south coast of Australia was discovered by Francois Tijssen, which I will put down here. I'm very sure I pronounced that incorrectly. I'm so sorry. He was also Dutch. And then in 1642, Abel Tasman's trip was actually the first known European expedition to reach Van Diemen's Land and New Zealand, whilst also sighting Fiji. So he really did a lot in his journey in 1642. And Van Diemen's Land is what we know now as Tasmania, because it was renamed to Tasmania after Abel Tasman in 1856. And I know that one because that's where my dad's from. So, fun fact. And Tasman also went on another voyage in 1644. So only 2 years after his initial voyage to what we now know as Tasmania. And this really contributed quite significantly to the mapping of the mainland of Australia, which he had actually titled New Holland. I can't turn a page. There we go. So even before, the first colonies were established by Britain in 1788, British explorers had been to what was then titled New Holland. So one such explorer was William Dampier, who landed on the northwest coast in 1688 and also in 1699, so 2 times within just over a decade of each other. And he actually published a lot of information on the Indigenous communities that were living in Australia at the time. And this was considered very influential during the time period because there wasn't really any other information available, at this time in sort of the late 1600s, early 1700s. So James Cook, which is a name I feel like a lot of people do know when it comes to exploration and sort of voyages, he was the next noted explorer. So in 1769, he didn't land, but he did go to New Holland, Australia. But in 1770, his ship, the Endeavour, actually anchored at Botany Bay. And then he formally, considering it was stolen, but formally took possession of the East Coast in August of 1770. So even before there were colonies established by Britain in Australia, they were claiming land already as early as 1770. So there were also plans prior to 1788 when Britain did establish its first colony, which was a penal colony, to colonise Australia, but none of these really were attempted or came to fruition for various different reasons. It was either things like people thinking it was a waste of resources for a country or it being too far away, so a mix of different reasons. And even in Britain, it wasn't considered an important thing for them until after the American Revolution. So after the American Revolution, Britain lost their North American territories, their colonies, sorry, which is where they would send a lot of their prisoners as well. So as Australia became a penal colony, that is what Britain was using a lot of North America for at this time as well. And their loss of somewhere to send their prisoners, as well as new prisoners, became a problem because they couldn't have them on British soil. So prisons were becoming too expensive to build, and then the floating prisons they had, like bulkhead prisons, were already being considered a health hazard, so they couldn't put any more people onto them nor build more of them. So it was actually Sir Joseph Banks who joined James Cook on his 1770 voyage, who recommended Botany Bay in Australia as a great place to set up a penal colony. And it took a couple of years for it to actually go through Parliament and be approved, but eventually a plan was put in place and agreed upon by Parliament, and it was agreed that a penal colony would be set up in Botany Bay. And that was the beginning of colonisation, was that penal colony set up in 1788. So the British settlement and colonisation of Australia really began in 1788 as a penal colony that was under the control at the time of the Royal Navy. So the first fleet, that was captained by Arthur Phillip, consisted of 11 ships that had over 1,000 people upon them to come to Australia. So, and this included 778 convicts, 192 of which were women, and 586 of which were men as well. So, they actually later moved from Botany Bay to Port Jackson, where a settlement was created on January 26th in 1788 at Sydney Cove. And this day, January 26th, later became Australia Day, and is still also celebrated every year today. So there's a lot of, interesting history around Australia Day as well, which will become clear as I continue to talk about the colonisation of Australia. So the territory of New South Wales, which was claimed by Britain, included more than half of mainland Australia as well. So they really hit the ground running in terms of colonising land. And from 1788 onwards, Australia was treated as a colony of settlement rather than a conquest, which is very interesting because this is due to the idea of terra nullius. So it's a Latin term which means land belonging to no one. So Britain was working under the idea that the land belonged to no one, because it was used to claim this land as unoccupied, even though it was inhabited by Indigenous people. Because to Britain, they did not matter, and therefore the land was unoccupied. So there were no treaties, there was no sort of discussions or reasoning or anything that went into it. Britain moved into Australia and just started taking land from the Indigenous people because they were working under this sort of legal fiction of terra nullius as well. And in 1790, so 2 years after the first colony was established, a unit that was made specifically for colonial service actually came from Britain to Australia to take over for the Marines, the Navy, who had been there previously. And a free settler population slowly but surely started to grow in Australia as well, of free prisoners, children, just free settlers from Britain who were moving over, and, soldiers who had finished their military service as well, and more. So, slowly but surely, Britain was creating a white settler community within Australia, whilst also colonising their Indigenous land of the Indigenous people as well. So, as the 1790s continued, Britain's sort of control over Australia really started to solidify, in the areas in which it had already colonised and taken over. So regular Marines and that newly specified unit, which I mentioned previously, which was called the New South Wales Corps, they were enforced to enforce control, deter and test, and also guard convicts. But as the British forces started to expand, this had absolutely awful consequences for the Indigenous communities of Australia. There was the introduction of foreign livestock that was destroying food sources for these people. And, Britain was occupying their lands with no consent or negotiation either, because of terra nullius, as I recently discussed. So Britain was just going about and occupying land with no care for the spiritual aspect it had for Aboriginal people, the fact that this is where they got their food from, they were introducing animals which were destroying the land as well. There was no care. And as more land was actually cleared for settlements, the white settlers were destroying sacred sites, hunting grounds, and also blocking and polluting vital food and water sources for these people. There was no care for the land or the indigenous populations that inhabited it. And then additionally to this, with their coming, these white settlers brought with them a lot of disease, which Aboriginal communities did not have the immune systems to deal with. They could not deal with these European diseases. And it said that things like smallpox wiped out an incredibly large portion of the Aboriginal population in the area of original settlement as well. So even if they weren't, colonizing land, by coming over, they had already started to cause mass death by bringing over sort of diseases that the Aboriginal people and population were not ready to deal with. And although there was unrest in the convict community, which did actually culminate in the Castle Hill Rebellion of 1804, mainly led by Irish convicts actually, there were other conflicts as well. And this is the one I'm going to talk about, the one that I think is very important when you're talking about the colonisation of Australia, is the Australian Frontier Wars. And so, they lasted from 1788 to as late as 1934. There was still, conflicts happening despite Australia becoming a federation in 1901. So these were violent conflicts between Aboriginal Indigenous populations, Torres Strait Islanders, and the white settlers. And these wars were sustained through this period. It wasn't a, deal of a couple of skirmishes here or there. This was almost continuous battle for their native lands against these white settlers at the time. So Pemulwuy, he was a Bidjigal warrior, which is an Aboriginal tribe, led an armed resistance against settlers for nearly a decade. With him and his followers, they'd attack farms, settlements, and supply routes, very similar to what the white settlers were doing to them. So in response, the governor of New South Wales at the time, which was Governor Phillip, the same person who came over on the original boat, and his successors ordered missions, which were basically just mass military operations to suppress Indigenous and Aboriginal resistance. But there was an absolutely massive power imbalance here, because although the Indigenous people had, the tactics, agility, and knowledge of the land on which they were fighting on, the settlers had firearms and government backing, so they were immediately at a disadvantage to these white settlers. And Aboriginal people did not just lay down arms and accept British occupation either, as has been reported in some contemporary history from the time, some diaries and things like that, but they fought and resisted this colonisation. They did not just accept the colonisation of their home. So in Britain, the Australian colony was still seen as almost like a dumping ground for convicts, but over time, mainly between 1795 to 1810, under various different governors, a more formalised system of land allocation, labour control, and military order came to be for the settlers. So they were slowly but surely building up their own governments within Australia at this point. So Governor Philip Gildy King, for example, gave the New South Wales Corps, as I previously discussed, incredible power, which actually led to the 1808 overthrowing of Governor Bligh, which was good and bad, because it actually exposed vital flaws in colonial governance that really needed changing. So after this, the British Crown, who had kind of put a lot of faith in the governors who were in Australia, started to take more control over their colonies at this point. So this period also marked a turning point and an entrenched settler presence, with land grants were expanding and convict labour was becoming vital and towns were beginning to grow. So it was clear that these white settlers were here to stay. They were not going anywhere either. But for Aboriginal people, the 1800s just gave way to more violence, displacement, and trauma for these people. White settlers were pushing further inland, with the frontier wars following them. And entire Aboriginal communities were pushed off their land forcibly and or also killed whilst this was happening as well. There was mass killing of Aboriginal people by white settlers. So colonial records actually really, as I kind of mentioned previously, downplay these events, but it's the oral histories of Aboriginal people that have been passed down through generations alongside more recent research that has actually proved that this was a battle for survival. They weren't just sitting down and letting this happen to them. They were fighting in order to keep their homes and keep their lands. And then missionaries and colonial authorities also began to sort of civilize, big air quotes on that, which just meant imposing British morals and ideals on Aboriginal people who, again, were living an absolutely fine life before Britain decided to get involved. They weren't civilizing them, but this led to the erasure of language, of culture, spirituality, kinships, connections to the land, and it actually led to a lot of the languages now being endangered. So as of 2016, 120 languages are now spoken in Australia. That's down from over 250 Aboriginal languages. And of those 120, 90% of them are considered endangered languages, which really shows what the white settler community was doing to the Aboriginal people and their cultures and their communities as well. Aboriginal children, Indigenous children, were also removed from their families, which laid the groundwork for the stolen generation, which I will do an entirely separate video about. I don't want to just sort of wash over it here, but this also continued with the stolen generation all of the way until 1970, and even past that, Aboriginal children were being taken from their parents and raised in sort of white households in order to civilize them, which is just absolutely insane, barbaric. You know, entire Aboriginal communities were ripped apart, relocated, which again, their connection to the land was so important to them. It still is today, intensifying disruption and trauma as well. You know, they were living peacefully, and then in only a matter of sort of a couple of decades, everything was being ripped away. I feel like it's important to note how quickly this colonisation was occurring as well. And this again was all helped by terra nullius, the idea that the land didn't belong to anyone. And by 1803, so not even 30 years since they colonised Australia, Tasmania was itself also now a major penal colony. South Australia, Queensland, Western Australia would also all follow under British control in the 19th century as well. So in 1829, Western Australia was formed, then South Australia in Southern Australia in 1836, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. So within 100 years of the first boat landing in Botany Bay in 1788, Britain had control of almost all of mainland Australia and Tasmania, apart from the Northern Territory, because the Northern Territory was not actually a separate colony, but it really did see an increasing British presence and British exploitation of them throughout the 19th century as well, similarly to the rest of the colonies that Britain had set up at this point. You know, and this was due to economic motivation, land hunger, agricultural ambition, and strategic colonial control. It's important to remember that this was all done with a purpose as well. It wasn't sort of just, you know, going out there and taking what they could get, for lack of a better term, as much as it's a very bad way to phrase it, I will say, but everything was controlled. It was a strategic takeover of this land. And this was framed as an absolute success for these white settlers who had come over. This was great for Britain. But for the Indigenous communities, it was just wave after wave after wave of dispossession of their land and their communities, their culture, their spirituality, everything. So as colonists pushed further inland and up coastlines, they really started to entrench on land that had been cared for by these Indigenous communities for thousands and thousands of years. But they didn't care about that, because that didn't matter to them. So in the era of the Australian frontier wars, the colonial governments actually sanctioned expeditions that ended up with the massacres, forced removal, and deliberate community destruction. So these were all sanctioned acts by colonial government, which I feel like is very important to note. So these massacres of Indigenous people were sanctioned. They were allowed. Britain did not care at this point. And many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders lost their lives at the hands of colonisers, with some estimates being in the tens of thousands of people, up, you know, at least 30,000 is the estimate I read. But again, it's hard to know just how many Aboriginal people lost their lives during these Australian frontier wars and outside of that, because of incomplete and also biased records as well. So this era also saw the rise of reserves. which were spaces designed to segregate and control Aboriginal communities under the guise of protecting them as well. So it was just getting, as it got better for settlers, it just got worse and worse for Indigenous communities as well. So as things developed, the governance of these colonies slowly changed from British-appointed governors to actually settler-controlled parliaments. So each colony had its own government, a bit similar to, state government in the US you have now. So this led to the growth of a white male landowning elite, which is, history repeats itself, who now had the power to create laws to protect their own interests, which, as you can imagine, were not in the interests of Indigenous people at all. So Indigenous communities were systematically actually excluded from government and politics as well. They weren't recognised as citizens, they had no right to vote, and they weren't even counted in the national census, which is absolutely insane. All of that is absolutely wild. In many cases, these people, who are human beings with rights, were treated under laws that governed livestock and fauna rather than people. And there was also the establishment of protection laws that imposed sweeping controls on where Aboriginal people could live, who they could marry, where they could work, and if they could even keep their children. And this was really in the guise of, fearing with violence and also paternalism as well, because these settlers did not see Aboriginal people as people. It's really important to kind of note that and realise that they were not acting in these people's best interests whatsoever. They were acting in their own interests, and that is what mattered to them as well. And it's just absolutely, it's insane. It's wild behaviour, if you ask me. But anyway, so despite being the original people of the land, Aboriginal people were completely excluded from colonial governance as well. The push towards self-governing settler colonies, which culminated in the Federation of Australia in 1901, had no place for Indigenous voices. They were completely ignored and wiped out of governance and politics. So Aboriginal people weren't consulted, recognised, or included in the emerging national identity that was becoming Australia. So in fact, they were kind of almost actively written out of it for numerous years. And this is true, because it was only in 2008 that there was actually an official apology from the state of Australia to Aboriginal, Indigenous, Torres Strait Islander people for what they had actually suffered at the hands of white settlers and colonisers as well. So as the colonies actually gained sort of legislative independence from Britain, they introduced laws that really entrenched this racial discrimination against Indigenous communities. So again, they weren't allowed the right to vote, they weren't allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to marry freely, maintain their cultural practices without punishment or fear or forced intervention. They were treating them as not even second-class citizens. These people who had come over and colonized this land were treating the Indigenous people of this land as completely less than, all in the name of civilization or assimilation, which is absolutely just, it upsets me if you could not tell. And this legal invisibility that they were building around these communities would shape generations of discrimination, as I previously mentioned, like the stolen generation that went through until 1970. Like, both of my parents were born in Australia. They were alive when these things were still happening, which is just absolutely wild behaviour. It's just insane, They weren't subject to federal laws, leaving their treatment as well entirely up to states, which, again, is just insane. Every white person in Australia was protected by federal law, but the Indigenous populations were not. So it is true that colonial records really dominate mainstream history when it comes to the colonisation of Australia, and there are still very powerful accounts, but there are very powerful surviving accounts from both Indigenous and settlers, Indigenous communities, and settlers, that reveal the true real human cost of colonisation. So Aboriginal oral histories that have been passed down throughout generations mention, memories of massacres and forced removals and cultural disruption, and many Indigenous communities actually remember specific events, such as like the Waterloo Creek Massacre or Myall Creek, where the trauma of frontier violence has really started to echo across generations, and it's still felt today. And these stories actually form really a part of the living memory of injustice, but also survival that Indigenous Australians had to go through in order to still be here today and, against colonisation. And then there's also settler diaries and journals, which also tell their side of the encounter, whether they were free settlers who came over or whether they were actually part of the colonial regime. One of these is actually George Augustus Robinson, who he served as protector of the Aborigines, which was that was his legal title at the time. And he recorded both the suffering of Indigenous populations, but also his own role within the colonial system, which is incredibly interesting. There are also letters called the Smith family letters, which I've actually studied in quite good detail for an essay that I wrote about immigration to Australia, actually. But these were just the notes of, Scottish immigrants to Australia and their lives. It was talking about the importance of religion for them, about people getting married, about everyday things. But that is still really important to show us what the lives of settlers were in colonial Australia as well, who weren't directly involved with the colonial regime. So most historians, whether, Indigenous or not Indigenous, have also worked to really recover the voices of Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, often challenging the official narratives that are known in history for these events as well. Those official narratives, that have been around for tens, if not hundred years, if not more now, really erased and downplayed the violence that Aboriginal people went through. Books and testimonies and, sort of public art projects are really helping to uncover the forgotten truths and sort of the reality of what actually happened during the colonisation of Australia as well, and bringing them into sort of a broader kind of public consciousness. And this also goes for, the legacy and ongoing impacts as well of colonialism. Although Australia did become a federation within the British Empire in 1901, Australian citizenship came into force in 1948, which really gave it its own kind of, separate identity from Britain as well. The impacts of colonisation didn't end in 1901 or in 1948. Instead, many of the systems that were actually put in place in the 19th century really evolved into long-term structures of inequality and harm. And it's only in living memory that these have started to become dismantled. But the loss of land for these people really meant a loss of food source, and the Aboriginal community, really meant a loss of food source and water and connection to country, which was a connection to language, spirituality, kinship, and also ecological. And then the destruction of, Indigenous law and culture through forced removals and, mission life and, the forced assimilation and civilization by British colonists has fractured communities that have been around for thousands of years and denied the transmission of knowledge and identity which should have been passed down throughout these generations. And this intergenerational trauma is really felt today as well in statistics that you can really easily see within Australia, especially in regards to health, education, and incarceration statistics as well. And it really disproportionately affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to this day. These are recent statistics. I'll put the link down below as to where I got them, but recent statistics show that Aboriginal and Indigenous Torres Strait Islander people are negatively affected in regards, compared to sort of their white counterparts and things like education and health and incarceration statistics as well. But within all of this, there is really a deep resilience of the Indigenous population, despite the extraordinary pressures that have been placed upon them throughout history. First Nations people and cultures have survived throughout language revival. As I said, 90% of Indigenous languages as of 2016, of the 120 that survive, are endangered, but there is work to kind of bring these languages back. There is community leadership, there is art programs, activism, and also just the retelling of history from the Aboriginal perspective, turning the entire colonisation of Australia on its head and hearing from the people who suffered at the hands of colonisation, and not just from the colonisers themselves. So throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, there have been key moments of recognition regarding the treatment of the Indigenous populations of Australia, but it was also very hard won and very overdue. So it wasn't until 1967, which is living memory, my parents were alive when this referendum took place. So I just feel like I really need to really bring light to just how recent this is. My parents were alive when this referendum took place, and it was this referendum that allowed Aboriginal people to be counted in the census and to be covered by federal law. 1967. Over 90% of Australian citizens voted to count Aboriginal people in the census and allow them the federal government to make laws for them. Sorry. It was an absolute landmark moment, but far too late. 1967. My dad was a conscious being in 1967. It's far too late that it took until then for Aboriginal people to be and populations, Torres Strait Islanders, to be protected by federal law and included in the census. That is wild. And it gets worse because in 1992, which is just 10 years before I was born, so again, living memory, all of this, 8 years before the millennium, the High Court only then overturned the doctrine of terra nullius. The idea that the Australian land didn't belong to anyone when the British arrived was only overturned in 1992 with the Mabo decision, which again is absolutely insane. So until 1992, Australia was still working on the obviously probably not a thought premise, but legal premise, that when Australia was colonised, the land didn't belong to anyone. So not until 1992 was there actually recognition that the land in which Britain actually invaded and colonised belonged to its indigenous population. And then it took until 2008 for there to be an official state apology regarding anything that happened to Aboriginal people, and this was for the stolen generation. And the Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, made an apology on behalf of the Australian government and the Australian state for the impact and what happened with the stolen generation, which I will make an entirely separate video about. I didn't want to delve into it here because it is an entire awful history in itself. But 2008, I was 6 years old, and only then did Indigenous populations start to get apologies. And then there was also in 2017 the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was a historic document that was created by First Nations delegates calling for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. So they just wanted to have, a consistent voice of Indigenous people within Australian government. Fair enough, in my humble opinion, because it was their land that was taken from them. But there was a 2023 referendum on this topic, and everyone, well, not everyone, that's a very big overstatement, but the referendum to enshrine this voice into Australian government was unsuccessful. So the referendum that took place in Australia, more people voted no than yes to allow a consistent Aboriginal voice within Parliament. I don't know the ins and outs of the referendum or what the law would entail in itself, but from, an outsider looking in, that is wild to me. I think that is absolutely wild. But obviously the movement for justice and apology and sort of recognition continues. And it has, there are things that have been helping, things like renaming, Aboriginal landmarks to their traditional names, getting rid of their anglicised names, such as Uluru, which was known previously as the Red Rock, has been renamed in law to Uluru. And this is happening across Australia and Tasmania as well. Tasmania is part of Australia, but, and this is happening, it's a continuous process, but it's finally happening. But in my opinion, a bit too much too late, considering Australia was colonised, in 1788 and became a federation in 1901. And it took until 1967 for there to be any real movement or recognition of the Indigenous populations of Australia as people. So overall, the colonisation of Australia was more than just Britain's sort of want for land and a land grab. So it still is having such profound effects today on Indigenous communities, with things like, it being into the 20th and 21st century that laws were in place for them to be considered people, really, which is just wild to me that that is living memory, that that was happening. And although these changes are happening, I do feel like they are long overdue and they should have happened far faster. But it is also safe to say that the colonisation of Australia still has overarching effects on the entire state of Australia. Things like, although it became a federation in 1901, Australian citizenship didn't come into force until 1948. Things like, to this day, the British monarch is still the head of the Australian state, which is insane to me. Queen Elizabeth is still on all the money. King Charles is the head of state, even though Australia is an entirely independent, self-governing nation. The effects of colonialism is still seen every day. Even things like the Commonwealth, which is, still an overarching sort of effect of colonialism. Like, I'm an Australian citizen. In my passport, it says under protection of Her Majesty the Queen. But, again, Australia is no longer a territory, a colony of Britain. And I do really feel like more sort of emphasis needs to be put on the voices of First Nations people as well, and we do really need to recognise that colonisation was far more than just losing land for them. It was losing culture, language, it was losing so much of what you would consider your identity if it was taken from you. So why is it that it took so long to apologise to these Indigenous communities that it was taken from? The land didn't belong to European settlers. The land belonged to the Indigenous people. That's the complete long story short of it. Britain had no right to go and civilise or assimilate a population of people who were living absolutely fine. They had no right to massacre these people, take their children away, all in the name of colonisation, and for that to still have lasting effects today. It's 2025, and the effects of colonisation that started back in 1788 are still being felt today. So, overall, the colonisation of Australia is an incredibly vast topic, and it is one that actually contains so many different, really rough aspects of history that have kind of been glossed over by sort of colonial histories and the idea that the victor writes the history books as well, with, the colonial history that Britain put out really erasing what happened to the Indigenous communities of Australia, during and after colonisation as well. So, yeah, all in all, the colonisation of Australia was an awful time for Indigenous people, and I do really feel that Britain really doesn't understand, maybe that's not the right phrasing, but the effects of what the country has done in its past, the effects that it is still having today, because it doesn't affect Britain as much as it affects Australia, might be a good way of putting it. But yeah, so that was today's video. As I said, a heavier one today, and I do want to just say again, I am by no means an expert. I do all of my research through my university's library, sources I can find online. I use a lot of Australian government websites for this video as well. But this is by no means a comprehensive history of the colonisation of Australia at all. And there are parts of the colonisation of Australia that I am going to go into further depth on in future videos as well, such as the Solar Generation and actually the creation of the different colonies within mainland Australia, and also a video on the Aboriginal community of Tasmania as well, which is something that really interests my dad, as he is from there. But yeah, so that was today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe as well. If there is anything in particular you would like to hear about, make sure to leave a comment below, and I will do my absolute best to put a video together for you and present it to the best of my ability. I have got a list going right now, and I will, again, for next week, put up a poll so you guys can vote on what next week's video will be. It will be ancient history as well. So I'll put up either 3 or 4 options. I'm tossing them up in my brain right now as to what I should do. But there'll be a poll up, and I will present that video for you guys next week as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a brilliant rest of your day, evening, morning, noon, or night, wherever you are.